Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is a program bringing you updates, news, analysis, and all-around information on a topic that you must pay attention to: religious liberty. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my guest, Tina Ramirez, founder and president of Hardwired. Every time I meet you and even think about you and read your articles, I know that there's so much going on in your life.
Yeah.
And a lot of the articles you've sent have been about work that you and your organization have accomplished and are ongoing, for that matter, in Iraq, the center of recent conflict. But let's go a little bit broader. You know, there are many troublesome aspects to modern life. The world is really a bubbling cauldron. But this radicalism that often derives from Islam is not just confined to the Middle East, is it?
Mm-hmm. No.
One of the most nefarious groups is called Boko Haram. And it's hard to get to the meaning of it, but haram means forbidden. And I think it's basically westernization or education forbidden.
Right.
It's a very retrograde sort of a movement. Have you had any contact with them? And I think you've been to
no, thankfully I haven't had contact with Boko Haram.
No, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
A closer view of them. No, not
yeah,
contact.
Definitely seen the effects of it. But thank you so much for having me, Lincoln, and for being here with everybody at Liberty. And it's, you know, Hardwired provides education and training in many parts of the world to ensure that there's local leadership for religious freedom. We have so many advocates for this right here, but unfortunately in many parts of the world they don't have advocates, and so they don't have someone to defend their rights or help them access justice. And that is certainly true in Nigeria today. Hardwired has worked in Iraq and other parts of the world, but Nigeria is one of those hot spots where it's one of the largest growing populations in the world. It's a very religious country. It's one of the most important economic countries in all of Africa. So it's really a linchpin country for the African continent. And yet it hangs in the balance when it comes to religious freedom and religious conflict. And so if we can establish leaders there that will support this freedom, we have the possibility of really changing the trajectory of the whole African continent.
Yeah. Yes, because it's a very pivotal country in all of Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as you were going through the situation again, it reminded me that I don't think I would define Nigeria's problems as predominantly religious. Mm-hmm. It's a huge economic promise that's sort of gone wrong. Mm-hmm. And as it's gone wrong, I think it's then sort of unsettled different religious communities. And in some ways, I think this Boko Haram is a reaction to what they see as westernization gone wrong.
Well, I think that the situation in Nigeria is a lot more complicated than that. Obviously.
Yes.
I mean, than we could imagine. Like it's not an easy thing to dissect, but there is many people want to see it as not a religious conflict. It's just an ethnic conflict or a tribal issue. But it is very difficult to separate religion from it, especially when. For your viewers that don't know, the country is largely split between a predominantly Muslim north and
they've had a civil war in the past.
And a predominantly Christian south. Yeah. And so when they emerged from the civil war, one of the more recent presidents took Nigeria into the Organization of Islamic Conference, and allowed certain Islamic laws into the country. And then in 12 of the northern states, they've all adopted criminal Sharia law. So this is where you can amputate the hands, etc. Yeah. So it's very criminal Sharia. But this has been going on.
Thievery.
This predates Boko Haram. So you have this bifurcation between the north and the south that falls largely along religious lines. And once again, there's a fear in the north that the Christians will take over the country, or that the tribes in the south, which are predominantly Christian, will take over. There's a fear in the south that the Muslim tribes in the north will do the same thing. And so there's this constant fighting over power in the country.
Tell me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that oil was the liquid that got it all going, wasn't it?
Well, there's definitely the problem of oil and resources in the south and the desertification of the north. And so the deserts in Africa are encroaching on the northern areas, which is pushing a lot of those communities into the south. But it would not be correct to say that just those things are causing the conflict. We have seen in the last 10 to 20 years significantly large-scale attacks where Muslim communities will attack like a Christian school in the south and slaughter thousands of students.
I'm trying to think what they call those fighters. There's a very unique term.
Well, there's different. I mean, there's the Fulani herdsmen. I don't know if that's who you're thinking of,
No.
but over time there have been different ones. These are just vigilante attacks that
they're
like
basically vigilantes.
mob attacks that have happened in the last like 10, 20 years. But in the last decade, we've seen the rise of Boko Haram, and Americans will be familiar with this because, and I think it was around 2008, we had the underwear bomber, a Nigerian that tried to board a plane and come to the United States and detonate a bomb over the United States, which didn't happen, thankfully, but he was from Nigeria. And I think that exposed this rising extremism problem and terrorism problem that was occurring that was really being incubated within Nigeria that threatened the West. But that did emerge into what we now know as Boko Haram, which is a terrorist group that has consolidated a lot of power in the north of Nigeria and that has attacked this idea of Westernization.
And I think where they really came to the attention of news media in the West was about 4 years ago when they abducted hundreds of girls, right? Remember?
Yeah,
from a school, and then they were sold into essentially slavery and married off, and many of them were Christian girls and turned into Islamic brides.
Yeah, and it was horrifying. The "Bring Back Our Girls" slogan, and the Chibok girls out of this one school, there were over 200 of them that were enslaved, and sadly, some of them are still enslaved. Some of them have come back, but there's a lot of just unfortunate treatment of these girls in the way that in society where they're not accepted. Some of them are coming back with children or with diseases or medical problems. It's very sad. But the larger problem is really that in the north you have a growing terrorism problem that has been able to appeal to a lot of the states in the north that wanted to increase their authority over the populace. And it's the northern states are not all Muslim. They're predominantly Muslim. So you have some states that might be 70% Muslim and 30% Christian, or 60% Muslim and 40% Christian. So they're still diverse. But what's happened is that the governments in those northern states have consolidated power under Islamic law, which has been bad for everyone, or for many of the people, not just for the Christians, because you have many Muslims that don't understand the laws, that are being prosecuted in Sharia courts, that are losing their rights and their freedom, and it's creating an environment of fear, of intolerance, of impunity, of injustice. So it's very terrifying for everyone.
Sharia is pretty much rough justice, and it's sort of traditional Islamic cultural ways of dealing with things, but they're not all hard and fast laws. It's just an accretion of things from...
Yeah. So Nigeria is very complicated when it comes to law, but every northern state has its own legal system. So there's 20 states in the north, which includes Abuja, and the laws are complicated. So you've got indigenous tribal leaders that are actually the people with some of the most power in the northern states. And you have states that are actually very open to freedom, places like Sokoto, and there's a lot of movement there, but overall you definitely see a trend where there's a closing to freedom and a fear of the South and of Christians in particular.
A lot of the news reports out of that area try to blame a weak central government. Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. No, the central government is part of the problem. I mean, every election, it alternates between a northern president and a southern president, and that typically also alternates between then a Muslim or Christian. And so it just reinforces this religious division within the country. But in addition to that, and there's major corruption in the South and in the government, there's major inefficiency in the government. I mean, it is the one country that I've been to where nothing makes sense. Getting a visa, getting out of the airport, driving, like nothing makes sense. And so it's a very difficult climate to work in. But in that context, we know that and there have been attacks against Muslims too in I think Yoruba, some of the other states in the Middle Belt. But and then the government has come in with Boko Haram, and they've tried to push back against Boko Haram, but in some ways they've actually overreached, and it caused a lot of tension and too many attacks on the community. So it's definitely a tense, complicated situation.
And it's not getting better, is it? It's probably
No, it's not getting better.
Solidifying.
But over 90% of the attacks in the north, where Fulani herdsmen are attacking people, they say it's because of desertification, but really those attacks are on Christian minority communities. And so there is a religious dimension to the conflict that needs to be addressed. A lot of what we see in Nigeria, and I was just there a few months ago, and I was there prior to Boko Haram as well, and I've held hearings on this in Congress. So in the last 10 years that we've been looking at this situation, we've seen that there's really just an ignorance in the society, a lack of education about what their rights are, what the Constitution says, because the Constitution of Nigeria actually protects religious freedom. The problem then is that when state laws contradict it, and then, because even in the Sharia states, if you're not a Muslim, you don't have to accept the jurisdiction of the Sharia court. But most of the Christians or people of indigenous religions don't know that. And so they're taken to the courts and they're harassed into accepting the jurisdiction of the court. But if they knew that all they had to say is, we do not accept the jurisdiction of this court.
I didn't know that.
That's all they have to say, just one word, one sentence. And then it would actually have to go somewhere else, and that would protect a lot of the freedoms. But on top of just that, you have an entrenched system of discrimination, impunity. And so those are some of the things that Hardwired is trying to educate.
So education's a big key, but in this case particularly, Boko Haram is against education. So there's even at this most basic level, you've got pushback.
It's true, but unless the populace is educated in what their rights are and in how to overcome the fears of one another, they won't be able to overcome the intolerant ideologies of ISIS or of Boko Haram. And so that's what we're doing, is we're basically creating fertile soil where people can then, when they hear these intolerant ideas, they have a filter for it that they don't currently have.
Let me throw in an interesting idea, because it's implicit in what you're saying, that in this country, education is needed, generally as well as specifically on freedom and religion and so on. But even in North America, like Seventh Adventists, within our religious liberty situation, we will defend Adventists in the workplace. But it's very obvious that most of that defense is at a lower socioeconomic level. Somebody who has more education and a higher level employment is not as affected by this sort of stuff. So over and over again, I see a direct tie-up between the education level of a culture, which tends to solve this and move it away from this village, to use a cliche, sort of a village culture with tribalism and prejudice and not animist, but basic sort of religious practice. You don't see that the more that the society is educated.
Well, it's in its access to justice.
Now, the answer can't be Westernization, because I know a lot of them are rejecting Westernization. But it seems to me in educating, you're doing a great job, but there's a need for the whole country to be educated away from a false social attitude. That's really what's going on here.
It's everyone. I think that's the important point, is that it's not just Muslims or Christians, that it's really, it's a national education.
And poverty, and along with poverty, even in the US, I see people begging on the streets. It's tied up to lack of knowledge, because there are support structures for unemployed people. They tend not to know that, so they end up stopping you at the street lights. So there's a knowledge component, and knowledge removes people from that problem. And the Bible says that for lack of knowledge, my people are perishing. We'll take a break and be back shortly. Stay with us. Welcome to the Liberty Insider again. Thank you for coming back. Before the break, with guest Tina Ramirez, we'd started off on talking about Nigeria, Boko Haram, and of course religious intolerance and even religious terrorism. But it's more than just religion, isn't it? There are many cultural and economic reasons for the instability that's developing there. And you've been pointing out always, and I know your organization, education.
Yeah. Well, and at the root of what we see in Nigeria is really these fears, these underlying fears and misconceptions of the others that are fueled by people that want to use religion to their own ends. But they're fears, and they fall along religious lines, and then they're reinforced, and then the people that are that make up the communities that are most affected it happens to happen along religious lines. So it is unfortunate, but to stop that cycle of violence, you have to educate the people, and so that's what Hardwired does. So we just a few months ago, I was in Nigeria, sorry. And we were working with a group of 20 leaders. We've chosen one leader from each of the 20 northern states to start training, and our goal is to establish teams in each of the northern states of leaders that can defend religious freedom.
Little cell groups for good.
But diverse groups, so they would include Muslims and Christians and indigenous leaders, and so lawyers as well as religious leaders, so a diverse group. And our goal is that we would teach these teams why religious freedom is in their interest, how to defend it. And when we've just in the last few months, in the last year that we've been doing it, it's been really interesting just to learn the lack of awareness of their own laws, lack of awareness of how to navigate the laws, how to access justice, that you would think people that are naturally interested in these issues would know, but there's simply no information about it. And so these are the first trainings that we've seen in Nigeria to provide that kind of information and resource so that the people don't have to just lay down and take whatever persecution comes.
Yeah, well, you told me something that I didn't even get it out of reading the news stories, that the Sharia law that's applied in some areas is not mandatory for non-Muslims.
Right, and so we have one lawyer that's working in one of the northern states who's great, and he went through the training, and then we do cycles of training, so they go through it a few times to really be able to sustain their own ability to train others in religious freedom. So during the second training, he came back and he had gone and tested the curriculum and applied it by training others. So we go and we have them test it, to see how they can do it, and then they come back, we try it again. And he had done the training with several different groups of other lawyers, one of which included a group of Muslim lawyers in his government job. And when he came back, he shared how one of the Muslim lawyers actually invited him to his village to share with the imam, the leader, the religious leader in his village. And it was like the tribal leader that was Muslim. And the tribal leader was so amazed as this lawyer was sharing about what religious freedom means and the economic benefits of religious freedom for their community, and sharing it in a way that would really resonate with this leader. And the leader said, "I've never heard this information. Where did you learn it? Where can I learn more?" So he said, "I'll come back and we can share more." And then the leader said, "Well, is there anything we can do to help you?" And the lawyer said, "Well, there's this church that has property in your village, but the local police won't let us build on it, and they've been harassing us, not allowing us to build."
So he gave permission.
So he got on the phone. He figured out who it was, got on the phone, and said, "I want that to change right now," and it did. They were able to build. So instead of having to go through this huge legal process with the courts, it was one relationship that was made, and it changed the situation in a village from one of conflict and intolerance that fuels violence and allows for Boko Haram to feed off of it and to gain access to the power there, to one of relationship and breaking down barriers and trust and
I can
pluralism.
See that you have the potential to just sort of a positive leavening, if you like, of the whole community with these ideas.
And that's what we've seen across the board. So our goal is that in each of these northern states, we would begin to develop teams that can go and disseminate training on religious freedom and help their communities understand how to interact with one another.
And you have big plans, but I'm presuming that there are other groups operating there doing not quite the same, but or what I'm getting at, you're not just alone. I'm hoping that many religious liberty and civil rights groups are counteracting what's happening, or is it just you?
No, there really isn't a lot happening in Nigeria, unfortunately.
That's bad.
And I've been following Nigeria for some time. I mentioned we had hearings on it in Congress. We followed it. When there's a big situation like the underwear bomber or the Chibok girls being attacked, all of the attention is on Nigeria, but then within months it dissipates, and so then people turn to another crisis like Iraq or North Korea or Iran. There's you take your pick. There's plenty of crises in the world. And so unfortunately, Nigeria has been overlooked many times or overshadowed by other global crises, the humanitarian crises that we've had in the last few years with the refugees. And unfortunately, that means that by ignoring the problem, it's just that climate of impunity continues to get worse. And so the situation has escalated there. But it is an extremely critical country in the region and in the world to to pay attention to. It's going to have one of the largest populations in the world in the next 10 to 20 years. Most of that population growth is occurring in the north, in the predominantly Muslim areas.
Isn't the capital one of the biggest cities in the world?
Yeah, and so you can imagine the tensions that this is going to create in the future if we don't address these underlying conflicts right now. It's only going to get worse. And that could be the next global crisis like what we've seen with ISIS if we don't address it now. So Hardwired recognizes these patterns and these tensions, and we want to work in countries where we see that they're at a critical turning point, that we can create change that can be sustainable for the future to avert larger crises.
Well, of course, with Africa, I don't know if you have the answer. It seems to me the world ignores Africa because it's not perceived as central to its political stability.
Right.
But if you ignore it too long, it'll blow up in our face. And where was the embassy bombing with the
in
US?
Lagos, I think?
Yeah, was, I mean, that sort of got American attention, and I think other than that, and you know, why, I can answer the question myself, but why is Nigeria not so important to US interests, say, as Beirut?
Well, it should be. I mean,
I think I know the answer, but
yeah.
These are, you would think, as from a people point of view and the influence on other countries, Nigeria would be more worthy of attention.
Well, in some ways, Nigeria is a really interesting example of pluralism in the world, because you've got such a diverse and vibrant religious society with the Christians and the Muslims there that could really be an example of pluralism and freedom in the world if it was really taken seriously, and if it was tended the right way. But right now we just don't see that happening, and unfortunately it's ignored.
Now, I heard, I'll run something by you.
Yeah.
I have no idea how you'll answer this. I heard a scholar the other day at some length say that his theory of why many of the world's problems are getting worse and worse is that we don't let conflict work its way out. Mm-hmm. That usually the combatants, whether they're religious or political, they fight till someone's exhausted. Mm-hmm. And the whole point is won, and then they go on and rebuild. When the issue blows up and things are at full tilt, then the UN or some group steps in and we freeze it in place. And the antagonisms and everything remain, or even get worse. They're just now not allowed to work out. I don't quite buy that view. I mean, it might be experientially true for the world as a whole, but can the alternative of education bypass what he was arguing, the need to just let the violence play out until it's resolved by scorched earth policy, if you like?
Right. No, I don't think that works in the world that we live in today with terrorism and
nuclear and all the rest.
People that are able to put extreme fear in the populace in order that, you know, you're not duking it out on equal playing grounds. That's not what's happening here. So you have situations where communities are terrified by violence and terror groups that are, you know, just putting fear in the population and then forcing them to submit to really dictatorial regimes and ultimately a lack of religious freedom. But what we've seen in places like Iraq is that when you ignore the religious root causes of those conflicts, you end up with situations that only recur. They just recycle through every decade. And in Nigeria, we've seen that as well. And so in order to really get to those root causes, you've got to begin to educate the populace in a way that changes the mindset of the culture, that changes the culture itself. And to shift the culture of a population, you really have to work through education in a way that will teach them to value the rights and freedoms of one another, overcome their fears, and be willing to live side by side in a way where they actively engage one another. And if they're just separate and they're forced to be separate, as you said, that doesn't work out either. You really have to, it's not allowing them to fight it out together, but it's enabling them to almost duke it out in dialogue together, or in active engagement where they're forced to work through their fears and misconceptions of one another, or the intolerance and the things that are fueling the ideologies that are allowing for the violence to occur in the first place.
There is no question that Boko Haram out of Nigeria has been one of the most fearsome forms of religious terrorism. Ironically, it profits from a sense of anti-education. Literally, it means education or knowledge forbidden, westernization forbidden. But yet when we're dealing about religious liberty, knowledge is vital, an understanding of how God works, what he wants for man, the rights of other people. This we have to learn, even though there's a certain innate yearning toward it. Religious freedom is not forbidden, and it should never be forbidden. And Boko Haram, ISIS, whatever it might be that fights against this, is putting itself against an elemental principle of the universe. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.